Among those journalists who did give their lives in the service of their country and the world and all of us, at least 4 have died in Libya so far this year. 2 of them are especially close to our hearts here at the Overseas Press Club. Chris Hondros, the Getty photographer who twice took home OPC awards, the 2005 Robert Capa Gold Medal for Exceptional Courage, and the 2003 John Faber Award for documenting the chaos in Liberia. And Tim Hetherington, winner in 2007 for his work in Afghanistan's Korangal Valley, and finalist just 2 months ago for the Academy Award in Documentary Films for Restrepo, and he was supposed to be, in fact, on our podium tonight to help present the awards themselves. Instead, both lost their lives 8 days ago on the front lines they were chronicling the rebel uprising against Muammar Gaddafi. So tonight, to pay a special tribute to Tim and Chris, 2 great storytellers who died so long before their time, we've called on a close friend, writer Scott Anderson, who will also read a tribute from his brother, Jon Lee Anderson. Scott?
Last Wednesday night, the photojournalist community in New York, along with a few writers like myself who cover conflict, gathered at a bar here in Manhattan for a kind of impromptu wake for Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros. These ceremonies, when held for people who have died before their time, tend to be a mixture of comforting and ghastly. And this was especially true that night, given the abruptness and the violence of our friends' passing. Along with remembrances of Chris and Tim, some poignant, some revealing, some just very funny, one question kept resurfacing among those mourning them: why Misrata? All we knew that evening was that on the previous Saturday, Tim and Chris and several other journalists had left Benghazi bound for the besieged town of Misrata on the western coast of Libya. After a 20-hour boat ride across the Gulf of Sidra, they snuck their way into the town that had been holding out against Gaddafi's forces, totally unsupported and largely unseen to the outside world, for nearly 2 months. The group had only been in Misrata for 3 days when the mortar came that killed Tim and Chris and wounded 2 of their colleagues, Guy Martin and Michael Christopher Brown. These things always look a bit reckless in hindsight, certainly never worth the price that's been paid. In asking why Misrata at the bar that night, I think Chris and Tim's friends were speaking out of a kind of shocked grief, that natural human impulse to pinpoint the moment when tragedy was set in motion, as if one might somehow reach back in time and alter the outcome. No, don't go. Because I think everyone gathered there actually knew the answer to why Misrata. It may sound trite or naive, but I believe part of what drives all those who do this kind of work is a secret ambition to effect change in the world. Perhaps not in any grand way, and I think we all recognize it usually happens through a process of accretion, our work joined to that of our colleagues. But underneath it all is the hope, the belief that the images we capture or the stories we tell might touch the conscience of the outside world, might lead to something better. So why Misrata? Well, why Tai Binh, the hamlet in Vietnam where Robert Capa died? Why Rogueberry Junction, the crossroads in Sierra Leone where Kurt Schork and Miguel Gil died? Why Goma? Why Grozny? Taken to its logical conclusion, why Baghdad or Kabul or Benghazi? Why not just sit back and accept whatever government spokesmen or rebel leaders choose to tell us? Because at the end of the day, it is all Misrata, and none of it changes, at least not for the better, unless there are people like Chris Hondros and Tim Hetherington willing to risk their lives to document it. Tim and Chris were beloved and loving men. Tim was 40 years old. He leaves behind his parents, a brother and a sister, and his girlfriend, Idil. Chris was 41 years old. He leaves behind his mother, a brother, and his fiancée, Christina, whom he was to marry this August. These were men who cared very deeply about those they were closest to, their families, their friends, and yet they put all that at risk, knowingly, courageously, so that the outside world might know, better know, what was happening in Misrata. I'd now like to read a few words from my brother, Jon Lee Anderson, another journalist. He very much wanted to be here tonight, but he's in his home in England, closing the story, ironically enough, on Libya. On an evening when the best work of the Foreign Press Corps is being celebrated, it is especially poignant that the event coincides with the deaths of Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros, two of the most gifted and committed among us. There are a great many people grieving out there, not only for the sadness of their parting and sudden violence of it, but for the loss it will mean to all of us in the years ahead. For some, it will be a personal loss. For the world at large, it is the loss of two men, colleagues but also close friends, whose work was contributing immensely to the understanding we have of our convulsed and often terrible world. Their work in Iraq, in Liberia, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and in so many other war zones also gave us a means, an instrument with which to feel those places, the sense that we were connected somehow to that person there, in that image, whose life Tim or Chris had captured. Theirs was a desire to live in the history of their time, and the making of history is often an ugly thing. It takes a special kind of person to live with death and witness it, to remain sensitive to it, and to somehow make others experience that sensitivity too. Both Chris and Tim did that. That is a loss for all of us. I had the privilege of knowing both Tim and Chris. In Libya recently, Tim and I spent a lot of time together and caught up on one another's lives. He left Libya and then, after a few days, returned, drawn back, he said, by what he had seen there. He was excited and told me about his next project, an attempt to document what happens to men's hearts and souls in wartime. He was also excited about working alongside his friend Chris. Among the things that drew the two of them together was a shared love for Africa. Tim had lived for several years in Liberia, the same country where Chris had done some of his finest work, and Tim was looking forward to their next shared African adventure. He told me this on our last evening together in Cairo as I was leaving the Libyan war zone and he was returning to it. We walked around Tahrir Square and he remarked how that patch of ground had come to symbolize so much to so many people around the world. Later that night, we said goodbye, and he went off to Libya to join up with Chris. When they died in Misrata, the two friends were together. And what they were documenting, of course, was not just war, but that thing Tim had remarked upon in Tahrir Square, which was the human desire to be free, a desire that through the work of people like Tim and Chris, hopefully does become the history of our time. Now here's a video tribute honoring their work.